That way everybody can hear without too much interruption. But that means that if you do have a question, and I hope you do, use the chat feature. And use the chat feature in our webinar. So, okay, it's 2:03. Let's get started. So, welcome. Thank you for introducing yourself and who you're watching with in the chat bar. That helps me a lot. If your microphone isn't muted, it will probably work best if you do, unless you are sharing. Um, it's better if you ask questions during the presentation via the chat feature. I will be going back and forth and watching who's asking questions so I can answer them as we go along. There's lots of spots to ask questions. So, all right. So I chose to focus on the transportation and warehousing industry in this presentation for a couple of reasons. First, the industry is expected to add jobs in the next year based on our office's industry projections published just last month. A commercial driver's license is also a really popular training program, not just in Wyoming, but around the country. And ironically enough, many people who get a commercial driver's license end up driving trucks or working in transportation and warehousing. So, it's just a really popular training program. I wanted to talk about the industry that employs many of those people who are trained. Also, in Wyoming, we talk about mining, oil, and gas a lot. We talk about healthcare quite a bit. We talk about tourism a lot already. I wanted to emphasize an industry in which one could find a decent paying job with limited training. So, and also this industry has a lot of great talking points. It looks different in different parts of the state, and you can get a lot of variety from just this one industry. So, all right. Well, we have lots of people attending today from different parts of this industry, businesses, people who help train for CDLs, people who assist others in finding jobs. I'm really looking forward to hearing these different perspectives because I don't do any of those things. I only look at the data, which I love, but it's really, really limiting. I'd love to hear what you're thinking as we go through our slides today. What do you see here that does or does not match what you notice in your area? What do you see? What do you see for the future of transportation and warehousing? And what are things like economically in your neck of the woods? So, okay. We have a couple of questions to focus on today. First, what does transportation and warehousing look like in Wyoming? And what do we need to consider for the future of this industry? But in order to talk truthfully about this, we need to make sure we're getting good data. No garbage in, garbage for us. So we'll talk briefly about how we get this key data. And I'm going to be your guide. My name is Caitlin Failer. I'm a senior economist at R&P. It's part of the Department of Workforce Services. I studied economics and geology when I did my college, when I did my 4-year degrees. I started my career in uranium mining north of Douglas. That was very interesting. I'm curious about everything. And for me, fun is making complicated data more easily accessible to busy people. And I think a lot of people like to make fun of me about that, but I don't care. I really enjoy it. So, at research and planning, we just do the numbers. We don't run any programs out of our office. Our funding isn't tied up in how well a program works, so we can more honestly evaluate it. A lot of our office's funding is federal. We use administrative and survey data, and administrative data is considered the gold standard of data collection, data analysis, and research. And I'm here to help you get the information you need to make the best decision for you and whatever problem you happen to be tackling. So let's look at the basics first. Where does the data come from? The data in this presentation and many of its derivatives come from the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, also known as QCEW. The QCEW is a mammoth undertaking, and the finished product that we get to use includes all of these variables. We can look up any industry by geographic area in the US, see the number of jobs in that industry, the average wages, how big the business was, whether the shop was owned by local government, federal government, was it a private firm? And we can see all of this information in monthly, quarterly, or annual breakouts. But the process that goes in to making this beautiful information possible is more complicated. What's really cool about this, though, is that the QCW is not based on estimates or surveys, but on administrative data. Like I said, the gold standard. We use the quarterly contributions report, the multiple worksite report, unemployment insurance files, and others. It counts most government employees and private companies and uses the North American Industry Classification System to group each firm, each establishment by their primary activity. When the information is being processed, it's checked and edited for perhaps someone entered too many zeros while they were filling out their reports, or it appears that numbers were obviously transposed and can't possibly line up with previous levels of from this company's report. The data is collected based on who worked during the 12th week, not the 12th week, the 12th of each month. But sometimes, like if there is a big storm during the 12th of the month, um, like how there were 3 major snowstorms in March in the Northeast this year, then sometimes the data does have to be imputed or smoothed to be actually representative of what happened economically during that month in that area, rather than just during the 12th of the week. Perhaps there was a big storm on the 12th and nobody came to work, and that wouldn't be representative of what's happening economically in the Northeast. So, um, finally, some of this information needs to be masked to avoid giving away pointed information about both people and firms. And this can be tricky in rural areas where there are generally fewer firms and confidentiality can be a problem. So, overall, the quarterly census of employment and wages accounts for about 95% of jobs worked in the US. But this data comes out on a 5-month delay because it is such a complex task to put together good data that maintains confidentiality. There are things not counted in the quarterly census of employment and wages. Check out all these fish that aren't part of the iceberg. On the left side, there's stuff like the NSA, which we still just don't talk about. And on the right side, there's people who are self-employed. We'll briefly talk about them later. Most railroad workers aren't counted under the quarterly census of employment and wages. There's a different program for that. And some farm and domestic workers. So these are called Bergy bits. It's actually a technical term in geology for when an iceberg breaks off another iceberg. I actually talked to another person in my office, Elise, and she also studied geology. And we had a big discussion about what are they called? They're called Bergy bits. Anyway, that's an aside. But these are programs that base some or all of their base information on the QCW. Includes programs like Occupational Employment Statistics, OES, or CES, the Current Employment Statistics Program. What questions can I answer for you guys right now about the data that we're going to use in this presentation? Are there any? I'm happy to talk about this now, or we can talk about it later, but use the chat bar to ask questions. So, okay, continuing. What is transportation and warehousing? So we're going to use this information from the quarterly census of employment and wages to talk about the transportation and warehousing industry. Well, what is transportation and warehousing? Essentially, it's businesses who primarily make money by moving things or storing stuff. So, yes, planes, trains, automobiles, but also hot air balloons, amphibian and duck tours, limos, water taxis, local trucking, long haul trucking, oil and gas pipelines, air traffic control, towing, tugboating, UPS, FedEx, USPS, and warehousing, but not warehousing as in Sam's Club and not self storage. Those are different than transportation and warehousing. Based on the 2016 data from the quarterly census of employment and wages, we know transportation and warehousing accounts for about 4% of employment in the US. It's about the same amount for Wyoming overall. 4% of Wyoming employment is in transportation and warehousing, but the details of how the transportation and warehousing industry is structured in Wyoming compared to the US as a whole are quite different. This graphic focuses on Wyoming employment, and the percentages from here on in aren't total employment, but employment within the transportation and warehousing industry. First of all, we have subways, taxis, buses, and planes, the parts of transportation and warehousing that move people. It's about half the size in Wyoming as it is at the national level. In Wyoming, air transportation, transit, and ground passenger transportation account for a little over 10% of jobs in the transportation and warehousing industry. In the US, this part of transportation and warehousing accounts for a little over 20%, or 1 in 5 transportation and warehousing jobs. Half of Wyoming's transportation and warehousing employment is focused in local and long haul trucking and local delivery, grain elevators, warehousing, but again, not self storage for rent. This part of transportation and warehousing is quite a bit bigger than the US. Almost 50% of Wyoming's transportation and warehousing employment is in truck transportation, warehousing, and storage. And this part is about 40% nationally. I believe that subcontractors moving oil by truckload to rail may account for how big this subsector is in Wyoming relative to the rest of the country. So remember that it's not just moving people and things in planes, trains, and automobiles that make up transportation and warehousing. In Wyoming, we cannot forget about pipelines. Employment in pipeline transportation alone accounts for 7.5% of transportation and warehousing employment, but less than 1% nationally. So basically, within the transportation and warehousing industry, Wyoming has about 10 times the concentration of pipeline jobs as the rest of the country. I have some really great graphics coming up thanks so much to the Wyoming Pipeline Authority. Wyoming has transmission lines for crude oil, natural gas, liquefied natural gas, carbon dioxide, refined products like gasoline. And when combined with support activities for transportation like aircraft services and air traffic control, towing, and tugboats, lots of those out at Glendo every summer. I'm not sure if you've ever seen, but pipeline transportation and support activities for transportation make up about 20% of transportation and warehousing in Wyoming compared to 14% nationally. USPS, alcoholic beverage delivery services, businesses like FedEx and UPS account for about the same level of employment in Wyoming as they do nationally. But what we don't see in this pie graph of Wyoming transportation and warehousing, what we don't see represented in the data from the quarterly census of employment and wages is, as we discussed, the railroad, which is not counted by the QCW. And businesses engaging in water transportation, no surprise in a landlocked state, and other businesses focused on sightseeing transportation, so helicopters, hot air balloons, space tourism. These two are counted by the quarterly census of employment and wages, but the data is non-disclosable at the state level for confidentiality. So nationally, sightseeing transportation and water transportation account for about 2% of transportation and warehousing employment. What kind of questions can I answer about the structure of the transportation and warehousing industry in Wyoming? Okay, well, I'm happy to come back to this slide at any point. If someone comes up with an idea, type it into the webinar chat. Sarah asked, what percent was postal service and couriers? What postal service and couriers? Hold on, I've got that. I think it's about 12%. About 12% postal service and couriers and messengers, and 12 to 14%. I will get back to you on that exact amount and how it compares nationally. So, okay, moving along. If there's no more questions, thanks for the question, Sarah. All right, so remember that the quarterly census of employment and wages is a great resource for information on employment, wages, industry, area, ownership type like government or private, and establishment size, but not occupation. An occupation refers to the tasks people do, like an accountant is an occupation, and there are standardized definitions for almost every occupation in the United States, and they're updated every few years. So, an accountant as an occupation can work in almost any industry, though. They could work for a company that makes money mining, they could work for a retail business, they could work for a school system. And each of those is a different industry, and there are standardized definitions for industries as well. Occupations are counted by the Occupational Employment Statistics Program, which we are not going to get into the details of methodology here. But this figure uses data from the Occupational Employment Statistics Program to show the most common occupations in the transportation and warehousing industry in Wyoming. There are a lot of people who work for the railroads and they make really good money in Wyoming doing so. But since the quarterly census of employment and wages does not incorporate the railroad industry, I decided to omit railroad occupations here just for consistency. So, not surprisingly, the most common job in transportation and warehousing is as a heavy tractor trailer truck driver. There were about 2,600 people working as truck drivers in May of last year, with a median annual wage of about $51,000. And again, omitting the railroad occupations, the next most common occupation was laborers and movers, a much smaller number, making about 30,000 a year. There were about the same number of delivery drivers as like light truck and delivery drivers as laborers and movers, but they made about 50% more than laborers and movers. These are also people who would need a CDL to do their job. Last year, there were about 450 mail carriers in Wyoming, making about the same as delivery drivers. So the ratio of heavy truck drivers, delivery drivers, and mail carriers in Wyoming's transportation and warehousing industry is similar to the national ratio. And when I say ratio, I mean the percent, the concentration, not the absolute number. There are never going to be more mail carriers in Wyoming than the rest of the country. I don't see that happening. But it's not an absolute number that we're talking about here when I say ratio. I mean the concentration that this occupation represents just within transportation and warehousing. So with that in mind, while heavy truck drivers, delivery drivers, and mail carriers represent about the same ratio in Wyoming as they do in the rest of the country, laborers and movers, there's about a third of the concentration of laborers and movers in Wyoming as there are nationally. For railroad occupations, again, which we aren't going into depth about, the concentration of railroad occupations in Wyoming is, depending on what you're looking at, 7 to 10 times the national level. So, are there any questions? Questions about occupations in Wyoming? Okay, like I said, happy to come back to this. Oh, one thing that somebody did ask is why are there so few laborers and movers in Wyoming? And I think that has a lot to do with whether or not there is a, um, well, it has to do with that Wyoming does not have any port cities. And port cities employ a lot of laborers and movers or large warehousing districts. Wyoming does have some warehousing, but it's not a warehousing central. So that would be uh, a good reason why there's not as high a concentration of laborers and movers in Wyoming as there are in other parts of the U.S. Okay, moving along. So not only is transportation and warehousing structured very differently in Wyoming than it is in the U.S., but each county is very different. To start with, I've got this great graphic from the Wyoming Pipeline Authority that Kelly, their GIS Pro, made for me. There's usually more transportation and warehousing businesses where there are more roads. This is probably the key finding of the entire presentation. Make sure circle it with the highlighter, write it down. Who knew that there would be more transportation and warehousing businesses where there are more roads? But there are. And another spoiler, transportation by pipeline is a big thing in Wyoming, and check out all these pipelines. Green is natural gas, blue is crude oil, orange is carbon dioxide, red is gasoline, purple is liquefied natural gas. And these pipelines, all of these, mean that Wyoming has the highest concentration of gas plant operators in the country, the highest concentration of industrial machinery mechanics in the country, the highest concentration of petroleum pump system operators occupations out of any other state in the country. It's pretty cool. So, according to the quarterly census of employment and wages, there were almost 11,000 people working in transportation and warehousing in Wyoming in 2016. Cheyenne, not surprisingly, accounts for about a third of the state's employment in transportation and warehousing, with more than 3,000 jobs. On the flip side, check this out, only 17 people worked in transportation and warehousing in Niobrara County. And when you look at the population of these two counties, like this is not surprising. And while knowing totals is important and interesting, when you're trying to figure out how much an area relies on a certain industry for its employment, for its economy, totals don't tell the whole story. In addition to totals, you have to look at concentrations. Overall, as we stated previously, the concentration of jobs in transportation and warehousing is about 4% in Wyoming, similar to the national average. And there are a lot of differences between how much each county relies on transportation and warehousing jobs. Goshen, Albany, and Bighorn counties had the lowest concentration of transportation and warehousing jobs in the state, less than 2%, less than half the concentration of statewide average. Weston, Sublette, and Converse counties had the highest concentration of transportation and warehousing jobs in Wyoming. Over 6% of jobs were in transportation and warehousing in these counties, compared to the state average of 4%. So 50% more, or more than 50% more. The average wage for people working in private industry in transportation and warehousing was close to 48,000 per year. That's a bit higher than the total average of about 45K per year for the average Wyomingite, and 2.5 times more than the average annual wage for workers in leisure and hospitality, who generally, on average, earn less than $20,000 a year. It's one of the other reasons why I didn't focus on tourism for this presentation, is that tourism is in leisure and hospitality, generally does not have as high paying jobs as the transportation warehousing industry does. So counties with the lowest transportation and warehousing wages were Bighorn County, Johnson County, and Niobrara counties. Less than 35,000 a year on average for the average transportation and warehousing worker. Converse, Sweetwater, and Sublette counties had the highest annual wages, over 55,000 per year. And kind of based on what is on how much pipelines and roads are in each of these counties, it can make a lot of sense. Does this line up with where you guys are, with what you guys see? Do you have any questions about wages, employment concentration, total employment? We can always come back to these slides. If you want to save your questions for the end, that's totally okay. All right, so in this section, I'm hoping to give you some more concrete information about what things may influence employment in transportation and warehousing. I want to give you guys some data to go along with your observations. We just finished talking about how each county is different. So, depending on where you are, use this data Use what you know to flavor this data. My colleague Matt Halama and I looked at dozens of variables to figure out how best statewide employment in transportation and warehousing could be described. We found, unsurprisingly, that commodity prices heavily influence transportation and warehousing employment. But somewhat surprisingly, since we hear so much about how isolated Wyoming is, the US unemployment rate and US GDP growth do seem to influence transportation and warehousing employment in Wyoming quite a bit. I'm going to show you a graph of one of the things that's most connected to transportation and warehousing employment. This graph will show us the statewide level of transportation warehousing employment in Wyoming since 2001. It'll be measured on the left side and in blue. Here's what it looks like. We can see Wyoming's bust in 2010. That happened right as the US recession was reaching its bottom and ending. We see the recovery, and then again in Wyoming, another bust in 2015, 2016. So now I'm going to add the level of employment in mining, oil, and gas since 2001. It will be a green line and measured on the right side of this graph. Keep in mind that these lines are measured on different sides. So at any given time, employment in mining, oil, and gas is at least twice as high as transportation and warehousing. But because of how this graph is arranged, it's not going to appear to be twice as high. Looking at both of these things together, we can see how tightly correlated employment in transportation and warehousing is to employment in mining, oil, and gas. And this graph just shows how related these two things are. On its own, it does not purely mean that one thing causes the other. You have to add in some common sense too. So, for example, a couple years ago, there was this joke graph going around the internet, very much like this one, that showed the number of people who drowned falling into swimming pools as it related to the number of Nicolas Cage movies released every year, with some commentary about how Nicolas Cage was causing drownings or causing people to fall into swimming pools. Funny, but not common sense, and definitely kind of an entertaining mix up between correlation and causality. So when we look at this graph, when we add in what we know about Wyoming's economy, and if we also know that a decline or an increase in employment in mining, oil, and gas often precedes a similar, not the same, but a similar reaction in transportation and warehousing by about 6 months, I think it's safe to say that there is some level of causation there. Not surprising for Wyoming. But this correlation causation is probably not true for other states. Employment in mining, oil, and gas is driven primarily by commodity prices. And when commodity prices are higher, gasoline and diesel prices are higher, and that makes businesses like trucking less profitable. And states that make more money off trucking than on mining, oil, and gas may find that when their employment in mining, oil, and gas goes up, their transportation and warehousing employment goes down. Questions about this graph? Questions about other states? Okay, we can come back. So statewide employment and mining oil and gas is like employment in mining oil and gas is likely a predictor of transportation and warehousing employment. So statewide it is a predictor, but still the level of mining oil and gas as a predictor of transportation and warehousing for each county is different. So in this table, we're comparing transportation and warehousing employment in Laramie County, that's Cheyenne, to Sublette County, one of the most populous counties to one of the most rural. First, the level of employment in mining, oil, and gas, the level of influence that employment in mining, oil, and gas has on each county is different. So, is employment in transportation and warehousing in Laramie County related to employment in mining, oil, and gas statewide? Yeah, a bit. The correlation actually isn't too strong for Cheyenne. A lot of businesses are headquartered in Cheyenne when there's a boom going, but relatively speaking, Laramie County has less mining than other counties. So it makes sense that there is some relationship, but perhaps not a very strong one. But mining, oil, and gas employment is definitely connected in Sublette County to transportation and warehousing employment. What about natural gas production? In Laramie County, natural gas production is not really related to transportation and warehousing employment. However, knowing what we know about Sublette County, natural gas production is very much related to transportation and warehousing employment. This makes sense given what we know about all the pipelines that run through Sublette County. So, oil production. This one kind of surprised me. In Laramie County, employment in transportation and warehousing is definitely correlated to the level of oil production. When oil production goes up, transportation and warehousing employment in Laramie goes up, and the correlation is quite strong. But it's not so in Sublette County. For this, I was pretty surprised. I know a little bit about the geology of Sublette County, but I like to hear if this lines up with what you know to be true for your area. So, finally, how does transportation and warehousing employment in the rest of the country influence counties in Wyoming? In Laramie, it does to some extent influence employment in transportation and mining, or transportation and warehousing in Laramie County. And remember, Cheyenne is a major intersection of two large interstates, I 80 and I 25. But in very rural Sublette County, U.S. transportation and warehousing employment is not at all related to transportation and warehousing employment. So, any questions? Does any of this surprise you? Does any of this look, oh, hey, maybe I have a good hypothesis for why this would may be? I'm really looking forward to hearing it. Okay, well, let's talk about the future of transportation and warehousing. So we can prove that mining, oil, and gas's influence on transportation and warehousing in the past, we can prove that there's an influence. And based on the structure of Wyoming's economy, we know it will continue to influence the future of transportation and warehousing in Wyoming. But oil and gas isn't the only thing changing this industry. Changes in government, technology, business practices, and training and career choices will alter the structure of transportation and warehousing and how jobs are counted. First, legal changes allowed Lyft and Uber to begin employing drivers in Wyoming a year ago. Lyft and Uber are part of what's being called alternative work arrangements. People who are doing jobs, on demand jobs, contract work, people piecing together jobs instead of settling in with a company. There are some analysts that estimate that nationwide 10% of jobs now fall under some kind of alternative work arrangement. And they think that this ratio has doubled in the last 10 years. So you can see this in Wyoming to some extent, that when the coal mines in Campbell County laid off people, they then rehired them back as private contractors. So not only are Lyft and Uber changing how people are moved, but now people who engage in the work of moving people are not counted under the quarterly census of employment and wages if they're working as independent contractors for Lyft and Uber. So people have been arguing about technology and automation and how it changes work and worth since the wheel. I'm supposing I wasn't actually there myself. Um, Self driving trucks seem imminent at this point. Radio frequency identification, or RFID, means things like smart pallets, part of the Internet of Things, are reducing the work associated with taking inventory and moving things by hand or forklift. Technology will continue to change the occupational structure of transportation and warehousing, and it could reduce the demand for occupations such as truck drivers, movers, and stock clerks. Businesses are also doing away with large centralized warehouses and switching to small warehouses using better algorithms to predict needs for consumers in certain areas. It's getting easier to do away with warehouses altogether because better prediction, better timing, better technology means that things can be transferred from a long haul truck directly onto a local delivery truck without having to stay in a warehouse for any period of time at all. It's a process called cross docking. It's been in use since the 30s, but with the advent of AI and predictive technology, this is becoming faster and faster. Warehouses may become a thing of the past. Finally, training has changed. The demographics of people getting commercial driver's license has changed. The type of work that people with CDLs want to do is changing. And there are a lot of discussion within the industry about the driver shortage. Some experts are insisting that there will be a shortage of hundreds of thousands of drivers in just a couple years, that we have to change our education system to meet the needs of businesses. And there are other experts insisting that this isn't an issue of a shortage, but an issue of turnover and retention of people with commercial driver's licenses. That workers maybe do not want to work for, it seems, especially long haul trucking companies, and manage the per mile pay scheme that's often used by long haul trucking companies. There are merits to both sides of this argument, but it does not appear that wages for truck drivers have increased across the board. Wage increase for an occupation is often a big indicator that there is a shortage of this occupation. And during the last boom, RMP did a similar study on shortages in the construction industry in Wyoming, and found similar things about people saying there was a shortage, but wages not rising to indicate that that shortage was a true shortage. Questions, comments about this from industry experts? I'm not an industry expert, I just have the data. Okay. Regardless of what is down the road for transportation and warehousing, Wyoming at Work still reports that truck drivers have one of the highest number of job openings in Wyoming. At the beginning of this month, with duplicate listings removed, there were 426 positions open for registered nurses in Wyoming, and then 267 openings for truck drivers, followed by jobs in the restaurant and retail industries, and finally 191 open positions for physical therapists in Wyoming. Right now, and in the short term, the need for truck drivers still appears to be pretty solid. And in terms of training and earning potential, getting a CDL could still be one of the fastest payoffs. You can earn a CDL, commercial driver's license, in 3 to 6 weeks and start making a decent wage in Wyoming, but is a much longer investment to get a nursing degree or a doctorate in physical therapy. Single parents, veterans facing homelessness don't have years to invest in schooling. They need a job now, and many find at a median hourly wage of $23.20 an hour that a commercial driver's license is the way to go. Questions? Carl wants to know, do you see the oil industry going down with electric trucks that are coming on the line? I think that the oil industry is separate from the industry that will be primarily affected by electric trucks. Electric cars are very important, but how are we getting this electricity in the first place? It's hugely still coming from natural gas, still coming from coal, and we're still needing diesel and gasoline to run most cars. Um, and I guess it might change the structure of how I think electric trucks might change the structure of how oil is distributed throughout the planet, but energy poverty is still a major, major issue for many other countries outside of the United States. And I don't, being able to have basic electricity is not a given for much of the world. So I'm not sure that electric trucks are single-handedly going to take down the oil industry. Maybe it'll change the distribution of oil, but I'm not sure that electric trucks are going to eliminate the oil and gas industry. Does that make sense for you, Carl? Okay. Thanks, Carl. Thanks for the question. So this is basically our last slide. Let's review what we've learned today. We've gone over a ton of information. We know that the quarterly census of employment and wages has an incredible amount of data and that it can be like an enormous iceberg to understand. We know that the transportation and warehousing industry is comprised of businesses that make money by moving things and storing stuff. But that pipelines are a big part of Wyoming, and moving people is a smaller part of transportation and warehousing in Wyoming. There's also a big difference between how transportation and warehousing affects county employment. We know changes in employment in mining, oil, and gas can precede similar changes in employment in transportation and warehousing by about 6 months. That changes in technology will alter how jobs are done in transportation and warehousing, and that truck driving is still an in demand occupation in Wyoming. So, that this will be our last online opportunity for questions, but you are always welcome to email me. If you would like to turn on your speakers now, fill me in on what is going on. I would love to hear your thoughts on how this data is different from what you like, from what you, not from what you like, but from what you experience in your jobs, what makes sense, what surprised you, what do you see for the future of transportation and warehousing? I'd even like to hear if any workforce centers are on here about how often they are placing people into CDL programs for work. Be also good to hear. Any anecdotes? I'm happy to hear them. Bill wants to know, is it okay to share the statistics on truck driving jobs or prior slide? Do you mean, yeah, all of these statistics here, Bill, are public. I got them all same manner that you can get them. I can help you find them. Um, did you want me to go back to a particular slide to look at? Is that what you wanted? I'm not sure, Bill. Okay. And I will send out all of the slides to everybody who attended after this. So you will have the transcript and the slides. So Mary Orr in the Casper Workforce Center has said that she's seen a definite shortage in qualified truck drivers. Mary, what do you think is pushing that shortage in Casper? I think I've looked at a couple different reasons this might have be, but I'm not. I want to know. You're doing the groundwork. I'm just looking at the data, and I need more information. Mary says that we have a lot of people with a CDL, but it's really a lack of job experience that's an issue. Yeah, I could see that. Like lots of people get CDLs and want work right away, but even the wages that I was presenting, the 23 and change an hour, those are median wages. They're not wages for people who immediately start work, and that's what you're earning. I believe Mary at the Casper Workforce Center manager said at one point that a lot of people will take jobs trucking and oil, but they're less willing to take long haul trucking jobs, and getting experienced drivers for long haul trucking is an issue. I don't know if you also see that, Mary. I'm pretty sure, or yeah, Mary and Mary. There's two Marys in Casper. Carl Clark said it's a nationwide problem after the enactment of electronic books in December. I did notice while I was doing research for this presentation that there was an electronic log requirement, and yeah, and that can be a problem with how the pay scheme is set up for people, especially in long haul trucking. You're getting paid per mile. You're not necessarily getting paid to sit in your truck and do an electronic log. So Bill says that he agrees that it is expensive for an employer to take on a new driver with that insurance also. Bill, that's really not something I'd considered before, not working on the industry side of things. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I didn't consider how new drivers and insurance would really do things. And for long haul trucking, I think that, could be even a higher insurance than, um, people who get a CDL and then work driving people like from Natrona County to the coal mines in Campbell County every day. So there's, definitely different parts of transportation, different ways insurance would be affected by that. Are there any people who train CDL for or help people train for CDLs on, what do you notice about your class sizes and the demand for getting in the class sizes? How does this relate over time, like when there's a boom or a bust? Do you lose people if you're in a business of transportation warehousing? Do you lose people when there's an oil boom? Do they go work elsewhere? Terry Wells says that I have several job seekers walking in to inquire into training through the WIOA, that's a federal grant for truck driving school, but I seldom have a client who wants to do long haul trucking. Um, Dina, Dina Crofts and Fremont County, what did I missed which part of that were you agreeing with? Absolutely. People going to work in other areas in an oil boom. Yeah, and I think that um, you see that in every industry, and it would be interesting to do some research on like how fast people from different industries show up in mining oil and gas during a boom. So, but yeah, Terry Wells, yeah, I've heard that from many workforce center managers and workforce specialists that you know people don't really want to do long haul trucking, and um, it's I read a review of a book while I was doing research for this that yeah, people don't want to do long haul trucking and do per mile. Like they want to be home in the evening with their families, and long haul trucking is not, you can't do that when you're taking a long haul trucking job. It's difficult to manage a work life balance. I am happy to answer any other questions related to um, transportation and warehousing as best I can, any other industry. Um, I email me or call me. I think here's our sources for today, which I will also send out in the email. You won't be able to click on the links directly in this slide, but I will send them out. And I guess if you guys think of something else, email me, call me, talk to me. If you think there was something totally off about this presentation, I want to hear it. If you think of future research that would help you do your job, I would love to be able to help you do that or do it for you. So, yeah, give me a call, 307-473-3808. Email me. My name is spelled a little funny. I apologize. I don't know what my mom was thinking. But let me know. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop the recording, but I will stay on for anybody else who has more questions.